Over my 20 plus years of gaming, Insomniac Games has remained my favorite video game developer. That's mainly due to my love for the Ratchet & Clank franchise, but they do have some other games I enjoy too, as well as some that I don't care much for. I've been meaning to make a top 10 Insomniac Games video for a while, but I wanted to wait until I played 10 different Insomniac IPs aside from RNC, so that I could make a top 10 without that franchise, because it would obviously take the number 1 spot. The upcoming Wolverine game was supposed to fill the spot for the 10th IP, but Ted Price has forced my hand with news of his retirement. For those who don't know, Ted Price was the founder of Insomniac Games and has been its CEO for exactly 31 years now, ever since it was called Extreme Software back in 1994. Ted Price has thus contributed a great deal to my childhood and life in general, and I should probably thank him for the existence of this YouTube channel. So thank you, Ted. As the CEO of a big company, I bet he's made a lot of mistakes, which is reflected in some of their games, but I can't deny his impact on the games industry, and I've always seen him as a cool guy, so I'll definitely miss his presence. I've enjoyed watching him interview other game developers on the Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences YouTube channel, and I love the Crazy Ride music video where he sings about Insomniac's history. That video was made on their 20th anniversary in 2014, so I wish they had made another one last year for their 30th birthday. Oh well, I guess it's up to me to honor their history exactly 31 years after Ted Price founded the company on February 28, 1994. You might note that 1994 is the same year the original PlayStation came out. Although Insomniac Games used to be an independent company, it has always been important for PlayStation, making exclusives like Spyro, Ratchet & Clank, Resistance, and in recent years, the Spider-Man games. They stopped being independent in 2019, becoming part of PlayStation Studios, for better or worse. Like, it made sense for them to join the PlayStation brand, and it has given them the opportunity to make even more polished and ambitious games, but it also means they're not as experimental as they used to be, and they're more of a Marvel company now. I have played 27 out of 36 Insomniac games, and 10 different Insomniac IPs. The top 10 will be of all the IPs instead of individual games, because let's be real, it would be boring if this video was flooded with RNC games and barely anything else. You might ask why I don't just do a ranking of all the games then, but that would be similarly repetitive, as most of the games from the same franchises are so close in my ranking. I will be talking a bit about every game within multi-game franchises, but their collective don't really affect the ranking of the IPs. I don't have much to say about the lowest ranking IPs, since I haven't played them in a while, I generally haven't spent much time with them, and they're quite frankly not that good either. I'll have more to say about the rest, which represents the best of Insomniac. I'm sure my list would look different had I played all of their games, but the remaining ones aren't particularly easy to access. In any case, here are my top 10 Insomniac games. We're making our games for you. The 2010s saw an interesting decade for Insomniac where they would experiment with making games for all kinds of platforms, including Xbox, PC, VR, and even mobile phones. 2015 was where Insomniac put their attention towards making phone games, those being Bad Dinos, Digit & Dash, and Fruit Fusion. I wasn't particularly interested in Bad Dinos, and it cost money anyway, so I never tried that. I wanted to try Digit & Dash, because that game actually looked fun, being able to control 2 different characters separately, but it was made exclusively for Apple, and I only had Android. So the only choice was to try out Fruit Fusion, which might be the most generic game out of those 3. I have basically nothing to say about it, other than that it's your average phone game where you swipe some elements together to gain points. Kind of like Candy Crush, but designed a little differently. I'm not a big fan of phone games in general, and Fruit Fusion isn't one that makes you addicted to its gameplay loop, so it sits comfortably at the bottom of my list.
You see the blood, the sweat, the tears, we're making your games, we're making your games.
2015 also saw Insomniac releasing a PC game, namely Slow Down Bull. I played a little bit of this, and it was somewhat charming, with simple but decent gameplay. The cute art style and upbeat music are fairly memorable, but the gameplay never managed to hook me enough for me to continue playing it, so I only played it once and never looked back.
You see the blood, the sweat, cheers. We're making your games. We're making your games.
Believe it or not, the first game Insomniac made for a different platform other than PlayStation was not Sunset Overdrive, nor was it Fuse. It was this obscure little Facebook game called Outernauts. That's right, a Facebook game of all things. If that wasn't enough, this is basically a Pokemon clone, where you use different monsters to fight other monsters. This actually made Outernauts somewhat fun to play, as I was a major fan of the Pokemon games back when this game came out in 2012. It was nowhere near as fun as a Pokemon game, however, so I only played it for a few sessions and never went back to it. Let's just say I'm glad Insomniac didn't continue making Facebook games.
See the blood, the sweat, the tears. We're making your games. We're making your games.
While not the worst, 2013 saw perhaps Insomniac's most controversial game, Fuse. This is not just because it's an underwhelming third-person shooter co-op game, but also because it had such promise before release. You see, this game used to be called Overstrike, which had a much more fun and vibrant tone to it. However, Electronic Arts got involved and messed it up, as EA does. Focus tests were held and preteens claimed that the game was too childish for their tastes, which led to an overcorrection of the tone, turning it edgy to a fault. I can't put the blame entirely on EA, as Insomniac did choose to change the game for the worse by listening to these kids who weren't even the target audience. I've only ever played the first level of this game, and while it's nothing special, I enjoy it more than the other entries I've already covered, enough to replay the whole level to capture footage of it. I could have sworn it only lasted half an hour, but it took me triple that length, and I still followed through, so that should count for something. I like that you can switch between 4 different playable characters, making the combat fairly dynamic. It also helps that some of the weapons are quite fun to use, which is expected of an Insomniac shooter. That said, the gameplay becomes repetitive relatively quickly, and I have no incentive to continue playing it. While I definitely don't need a sequel to Fuse, I would be interested in seeing Overstrike get resurrected. I doubt that would ever happen though.
The blood, the sweat, the tears. We're making your games. We're making your games.
Now we're getting into some good games, the first of which being Song of the Deep from 2016. Without having finished it, I actually included this game in my top 10 2D games list from the same year. Yeah, it's been a minute. I have since finished the game and I'm not sure if I would include it in that list anymore. Not that I dislike it, it just got a bit monotonous as it went on. Still, this game is definitely more enjoyable than the others I've listed so far, and that's because the gameplay is generally fun, the art style looks nice, and the soundtrack is lovely. Just listen to the main theme, it's beautiful. The story is good too, and more involved than you'd expect. The premise is very simple, main character Marin's goal being to find her missing father in the ocean's depths, but Marin continually reveals interesting lore bits as she narrates the adventure, with a very soothing voice at that. The relaxing tone of the game is probably its best aspect, though it is often broken up by some annoying enemies. Song of the Deep isn't a favorite of mine, but it's a good game that I'm glad exists. It's definitely the best 2D game Insomniac has made.
See the blood, the sweat, the tears. We're making your games. We're making your games.
We finally reached the first Insomniac IP that has more than a single game to it, and the lowest multi-game franchise on this list is Resistance. I typically don't find much enjoyment in first-person shooters, which is why Resistance isn't higher on my list, but I did enjoy these games enough to finish all 3 of them back in 2018. I think the main reason I have fun playing Resistance is that it carries over Ratchet & Clank's premise of using creatively designed weapons to blow shit up, though I prefer to use them in a genre that doesn't feel so limiting to my perspective and movement. My adjustment to the genre might have played a role in the first game, Fall of Man, being my least favorite in the trilogy, along with the dull visuals and storytelling. Interestingly enough though, when I replayed the game a bit to capture footage for this video, I actually came around to this tone, finding it quite effective for the gritty vibe Insomniac was going for, so perhaps it's not my least favorite anymore. I would have liked to find out, but annoyingly, neither my disc for Resistance 2 nor 3 seem to work on my PlayStation 3 anymore. Oh well, from what I remember, Resistance 2's more colorful tone was very refreshing to me, and the emphasis on spectacle made it more exciting to play. I can see why Fall of Man purists would be disappointed by the sequel's drastic changes, but they improved my experience for the most part. Dropping the weapon wheel might have been unnecessary, but I actually didn't mind it for the variety it enabled, as I stole different weapons from enemies, which is a gimmick I also enjoy in the Uncharted games. My favorite weapon is the auger, and I'm glad the sequel really beefed up its shields, because they used to be quite inefficient. I even found the story more interesting, even though Nathan Hale still felt like a cardboard cutout, so I didn't mind that Insomniac killed him off at the end. My least favorite thing about Resistance 2 is how relentlessly difficult it can be, but even then I enjoyed the gameplay more than Fall of Man's. Resistance 2's biggest strength might be how it looks. It came out in 2008, only 2 years after the PlayStation 3's launch, and yet it's one of the prettiest games on the system. That alien invaded San Francisco shot still lives rent-free in my mind. It's stunning. Even though Resistance 3 is newer, releasing in 2011, I honestly don't think it looks as good as 2. There's something about the 2011 to 2013 era of Insomniac that made their games look cheaper, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like that might be due to a change in game engine, along with a reduced frame rate, making everything choppier. It also doesn't help that Resistance 3 is less vibrant than 2, being more akin to Fall of Man. Other than that, I enjoy 3 about as much as 2. I like that it's not nearly as difficult, and that the weapon wheel returned. It probably has the most fun gameplay in the series, but the overall experience is dragged down a bit by less appealing visuals and a story I don't really care about. After Resistance 3 came out, Ted Price publicly announced that they would stop making Resistance games, and considering I'm not a huge fan of the series, that doesn't upset me at all. I wouldn't be opposed to a Resistance 4 or a remake of the trilogy, but it's not something I'm craving for. Okay, maybe I am, since my PS3 won't allow me to replay Resistance 2 and 3.
See the blood, the sweat, the tears. We're making your games. We're making your games.
Next up is Insomniac's first flagship title that boosted their success on the original PlayStation, Spyro the Dragon. Although this franchise has a bunch of games made by various developers, it's another Insomniac trilogy, and every game in it is quite good. They all have such a nostalgic charm to them, featuring colorful environments and magical soundtracks composed by none other than Stuart Copeland, former drummer for The Police, so the aesthetics in the series are top-notch. There's not a big emphasis on story, so it's mainly the gameplay that differentiates these games in quality. The original Spyro the Dragon is the simplest game, but it's a good simplicity that has allowed the game to age well without getting dragged down by gimmicky designs, aside from a few exceptions, I suppose. Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage introduces more gameplay elements with various power-ups and minigames, and though some of them can be quite annoying, I enjoy most of them and appreciate the depth they add to the otherwise simplistic gameplay. The swimming mechanics in particular are surprisingly intuitive for such an old game. Ripto's Rage is still my favorite Spyro game, and that's partly because it introduces the best characters, like Hunter, Moneybags, and Ripto. Ripto's boss fight is such an epic way to end the game too. Spyro 3 Year of the Dragon is my least favorite of the trilogy, as it introduces some new playable characters that aren't particularly fun to play as. They are fun in terms of personality though, and so is Bianca, whereas the Sorceress is a fairly forgettable villain, and her boss fight was an underwhelming way to end the trilogy. Oh well, Year of the Dragon is still a fun game in spite of these issues, and at least it gave us Spyro Hawk's Pro Skater. Like Resistance, I'm not upset by Insomniac's decision to move on from Spyro. It did lead to Ratchet & Clank after all. That said, I would very much like to see a Spyro 4 come to fruition, and it doesn't even have to be developed by Insomniac. Toys for Bob made a solid remake in the Spyro Reignited trilogy, not to mention a terrific follow-up to the Crash Bandicoot trilogy, so I'm confident that they could give justice to a Spyro sequel as well.
See the blood, the sweat, the tears. We're making your games. We're making your games.
Around 10 years ago, there were rumors about Sucker Punch making a Spider-Man game. I thought that made a lot of sense, considering their work on Infamous, which were inspired by superhero comics, and the Sly Cooper games are practically playable comic books. When it turned out to be Insomniac instead, I was surprised, but still excited, since I love Insomniac, and as it turned out, they knew what they were doing. They've released 3 great Spider-Man games over the course of 5 years, and I'm sure there are more to come, considering how successful they've been. Their first Spider-Man outing might have the most basic gameplay, but the combat and traversal are still very fun and become gradually better as you level up Peter's abilities. The ability to swing across a beautiful recreation of New York feels very nice, complete with solid orchestral music. Insomniac might not be known for having written some of the best stories and characters in gaming, but this Spider-Man game probably showcases the peak of their writing capabilities. Peter Parker is such a lovable character, and to contrast his positive attitude with such a sad narrative was done really well. The ending is particularly heartbreaking as he's forced to choose between saving his Aunt May or the rest of the city, right after having fought his former boss and friend Otto Octavius. The game manages to juggle a lot of different plot points and characters, making for a tightly written story that's among my favorites in the video game medium. Miles Morales is a shorter game, but it still provides a good length of quality and fun. I'll admit the story isn't anywhere near as compelling as the last, but it's still competently written, and the improved gameplay makes up for it. Getting 100% in this entry is a lot more fun and gives better rewards, which even feeds into the storytelling of the city. Being a PlayStation 4/5 hybrid makes it look better too, and I love the aesthetic of pink-tinted sky during winter. I also prefer the more trap-like soundtrack that feeds into Miles' taste in music. It doesn't sound quite as generic as Peter's themes. Miles Morales is definitely my least favorite of the trilogy, mainly due to the weaker narrative, but it's a necessary transitional title that I like a lot. Marvel Spider-Man 2 is the most recent one, and I think it's my favorite. The writing doesn't reach the heights of the first, and has some glaring flaws regarding Mary Jane in particular, but most of the plot threads and characters resonated with me. Kraven is such a cool villain, and the symbiote allows for some interesting drama, twisting good people's intentions into bad actions. This game was made for the PlayStation 5, which doesn't just allow for better visuals, but better gameplay as well, since the fast SSD makes the traversal much faster than before, making it even more satisfying. The combat is better too, especially since you can switch between Peter and Miles, who have their own unique abilities. Peter's destructive venom powers feel especially amazing to use, which is pretty meta if you ask me. Marvel Spider-Man 2 might not be as expertly written as the first one, but it probably offers my favorite overall package. For as great as these Spider-Man games are, I am worried that their enormous success compels Insomniac to continue in this direction of making Marvel games instead of their own original IPs. This might not have been a problem had they been able to release games just about yearly like before, but since games take so long to develop nowadays, we might not be seeing anything else from them for a while, which is a major shame. I still look forward to Marvel Spider-Man 3 and Wolverine, but I want Insomniac to make other stuff too.
See the blood, the sweat, the tears. We're making your games. We're making your games.
During Insomniac's experimental years, they managed to cook up an absolute banger, and the funny thing is, it got published by PlayStation's rival, Microsoft. I'm glad that this partnership didn't last, as I don't want a good reason to buy an Xbox console, and Sunset Overdrive was the only reason I even considered potentially buying an Xbox One, aside from Rare Replay. Fortunately, it came to PC 4 years after its release, meaning I could play it no problem. And it was well worth the wait, because Sunset Overdrive kicks ass. I'll admit its writing isn't the best, with many jokes that fall flat and a practically non-existent story, so most gamers would probably scoff at me for putting it above Insomniac's Spider-Man games, which are great in just about every area. However, I usually prioritize gameplay over writing, and I have a lot more fun playing Sunset Overdrive than Spider-Man. They're similar in nature, as both emphasize smooth traversal in an open world, but Sunset Overdrive is more involved with its traversal options. You can't just swing yourself across the map, you have to actively engage with it, jumping off bouncy objects, running on walls, and latching onto rails, all the while using a creative lineup of explosive weapons to kill a bunch of enemies. I don't even need to explain why that appeals to me. I might not enjoy this gameplay loop as much as Ratchet & Clank's, but it's highly fun and addictive nonetheless. This is especially because the game rewards you for chaining the mechanics together, turning you quicker and deadlier as you stack up the style meter, which is immensely satisfying. The aesthetics go so crazy when you're at max style level. While I still haven't touched any of the Spider-Man DLCs, I played both of Sunset Overdrive's, and they're a lot of fun too. I'd say they complete each other, as the Mystery of Moo Oil Rig has a very fun campaign and map, but a lackluster boss fight, whereas the campaign in Dawn of the Rise of the Fallen Machines isn't quite as fun, but the boss fight is amazing. Before Sunset Overdrive even came out, I would keep up with Sunset TV, which was a preview series about the game hosted by the charismatic Brandon Winfrey. So not only was it fun to see these videos make their way into the game, but B-Win basically being the final boss of the game made me extremely giddy. Even though the writing can be hit or miss, Sunset Overdrive doesn't take itself seriously, which allows unforgettable moments like this to happen. This silly tone was very refreshing in an age where a lot of games were trying to be overly serious and hyper-realistic. One of the trailers for Sunset Overdrive even poked fun at this, and it was glorious. The vibrant art style and punk rock music were a breath of fresh air, and even though it's cheesy, the awesome apocalypse really does make you feel awesome. Sunset Overdrive is the type of game I wish Insomniac made more of, a silly and creative game that prioritizes fun over anything else. I sincerely wish Insomniac makes a sequel to this underrated gem one day.
See the blood, the sweat, the tears. We're making your games. We're making your games.
To absolutely no one's surprise, Ratchet & Clank takes the top spot. This has always been my favorite franchise, regardless of medium. It's not a perfect series, as some of the games aren't very good, but I enjoy most of them, and about half of them are some of my absolute favorite games to this day. The original RNC for the PlayStation 2 might have been the first game I ever played, and is certainly my most nostalgic one. The magical atmosphere, the entertaining writing, and the fun gameplay makes it part of my top 5 favorite games. The sequel Going Commando is tied for my absolute favorite game, being an audiovisual treat that's hilariously written, and features the series' best gameplay innovations that would influence every other RNC game. I might find Up Your Arsenal overrated, but it's nevertheless in my top 10 favorite games for its outstanding comedy, banger soundtrack, and fun combat. Ratchet Deadlock perfects the combat, has an awesome tone to it, and features more clever satire, but its lack of certain RNC staples keeps it from going in my top 10 favorite games. The PlayStation 3 era wasn't as consistent for RNC, but I love the Future series, Tools of Destruction being part of my top 10 favorite games for featuring some of the best gameplay, some intriguing storytelling, and some beautiful visuals. Quest for Booty is the first outlier, as it's too short to realize its potential, but it's still an enjoyable adventure that carries over some good elements from its predecessor and introduces a vital gimmick to bridge the gap to its successor. A Crack in Time is tied for my absolute favorite game, having the best gameplay in the series, the best atmosphere in space, and the story that affects me the most, largely due to the beautiful cutscenes. All for One might be a disappointing follow-up, but it does have creative gameplay and fairly fun writing. Full Frontal Assault is easily Insomniac's worst RNC game, as the gameplay becomes repetitive despite being so short, the atmosphere is dull, and the story is a whole bunch of nothing. Into the Nexus was somewhat a return to form, having really fun gameplay, good atmosphere, and an interesting story, but it's too short to be considered one of my absolute favorites. The PlayStation 4 era sadly only saw the release of a single RNC game, which was a disappointment at that. I do love the gameplay and visuals, saving it from going too low on my ranking, but the music is so bland, and the writing is mostly cringeworthy. Fortunately, Rift Apart for the PlayStation 5 is so much better, becoming part of my top 10 favorite games due to its incredible gameplay and visuals, and I wasn't disappointed with the soundtrack and writing either. I very much look forward to the next RNC game, whenever that is, and hopefully it can finally give some resolution to Ratchet & Clank's long journey together, at least in regards to finding the Lombaxes. The franchise has had its ups and downs, but I will forever love Ratchet & Clank, which made me the gamer I am today, and is probably the main reason I even created this YouTube channel. I will continue to make review videos of the games, at least those made by Insomniac, and the next one will probably be about Ratchet Deadlocked, maybe later this year on its 20th anniversary. That was my top 10 Insomniac games. Not an ideal top 10, as I don't care much for number 10 through 7 and I've barely put any time into them, but I enjoyed the rest enough to finish them, and the top 3 are marvelous. Insomniac might not have a perfect track record, but they have more hits than misses, and that's very impressive considering how much they've experimented with making different games for different systems, not to mention the sheer quantity throughout the years. There are still 9 Insomniac games I haven't played, and though I don't care to try out most of them, there are a couple I would like to play someday. I said I'm not a big fan of first-person shooters, but Disruptor is still the Insomniac game I want to play the most, as it was their very first one, released all the way back in 1996, so it feels like required playing. I have no incentive to try Bad Dinos, but if the opportunity arises someday, I'll definitely play Digit and Dash. I'm somewhat interested in some of Insomniac's virtual reality titles, like Edge of Nowhere, The Unspoken, and Stormland, but only if I could play them for free, as I don't care enough about VR to invest in it. As for Feral Rights, Strangelets, and Seedling, I haven't found a compelling reason to play either of those, even if I had the means to. I'm actually a lot more interested in an Insomniac game that got cancelled. Not Girl with a Stick, as Kena Bridge of Spirits already exists, but Monster Knight looked very fun and unique, being able to use a variety of monsters like weapons, armors, items, and means of transport. I honestly want Insomniac to bring this concept back to life more than I want them to make a Wolverine game. I will of course be playing Wolverine, and I reckon it'll be one of their best games, maybe as high as number 4 on this list, but I'm not quite on board with the marvelization of my favorite video game developer. I've witnessed how creative Insomniac can be, so I don't want them to limit themselves to a niche, albeit a massive audience. I don't dislike Marvel, but I'm not the biggest fan either. It'll be interesting to follow Insomniac's future regardless, especially now that Ted Price is stepping down as its CEO. Goodbye, Ted. It's been a crazy ride. I'm Arcadon, and hopefully you'll see me next time!